When I first moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, I was thrilled. It was exactly what I needed. A fresh start, a peaceful place to escape from the chaos of my old life. The house next door was occupied by Mr. Harris, an older man in his late 60s who seemed kind and harmless. He introduced himself the first day I moved in, bringing over a batch of cookies as a welcome gesture. We chatted for a bit. He told me he had lived there for decades, keeping to himself after his wife passed away. He seemed lonely, and we began chatting more whenever I saw him tending to his garden. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I settled in, enjoying the calm of the neighborhood. But then one evening, as I was unpacking some boxes, a breaking news alert flashed on the TV. A dangerous convict had escaped from a nearby prison. The report mentioned that he was violent and armed. They warned people in the area to stay vigilant. I couldn't help but feel a chill crawl down my spine. At first, I didn't think much of it. What were the chances he'd come here? This was a quiet, tucked-away neighborhood after all. But over the next few days, I started to notice odd things about Mr. Harris. He began acting differently. His once calm demeanor seemed tense, almost on edge. I started seeing him leave his house late at night, something he had never done before. I'd hear his car start up around 2 a.m., and he wouldn't return until hours later. I told myself it was none of my business, but my gut kept telling me something was off. One afternoon, I saw him talking on the phone in his front yard. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but from the few snippets I overheard, it didn't sound like an ordinary conversation. He kept looking around nervously, as if he was afraid someone would catch him. I remember thinking maybe he was just talking to family, but then, why would he seem so secretive? Things only got stranger. I would go days without seeing him at all, and then he would reappear out of nowhere, acting like nothing was wrong. I started avoiding him, keeping my distance, but the feeling of unease never went away. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to take out the trash. As I stepped outside, I saw movement from Mr. Harris's house. His lights were off, but I could see a shadowy figure moving through his backyard. My heart raced. Was it him? Or was it someone else? I quietly slipped back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing. Could it be the escaped convict? Was I overreacting, letting my imagination run wild? The next day, the news report mentioned that the escaped prisoner was still on the loose. They hadn't caught him yet, but there were sightings in neighborhoods just like mine. That was when the final piece fell into place. I saw Mr. Harris leaving his house again, but this time he was carrying a large duffel bag. He glanced around, looking nervous, and slipped into his car. I stood frozen at the window, watching him drive off, my mind swirling with suspicion. It all clicked. The late-night outings, the nervous behavior, the phone calls. Mr. Harris wasn't the harmless old man I thought he was. He had to be connected to the escaped convict. Maybe he was hiding him, or worse, maybe he was him. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking. They told me to stay inside and lock the doors while they sent someone to investigate. Hours passed, and I sat in my dark living room, too scared to move, waiting for any sign of what was happening. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of police cars pulling up next door. Officers surrounded Mr. Harris's house, but it was quiet. No sounds, no commotion. After what felt like an eternity, they knocked on my door. The officer explained that they hadn't found anything, no sign of Mr. Harris, no sign of the convict. Just an empty house. As they left, the unease remained. I locked the door behind them, trying to convince myself that it was over, that everything was fine. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. It was nearing midnight, and I'd been driving for hours down that endless stretch of highway. The moonlight barely lit the desolate road, making everything around me seem like it stretched into oblivion. I had the radio low, more to keep me company than anything. Being a long-haul trucker, you get used to the loneliness of the road, but that night felt different. It was too quiet, too empty. I was somewhere between nowhere and nothing when I saw him. A guy, mid-30s, standing on the side of the road, thumb out. It wasn't often you saw hitchhikers anymore, especially out here. At first, I wasn't going to stop. Who picks up a stranger at night on a road like this? But something in me, maybe the need for company or the guilt of leaving him out there, made me slow down. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just trying to get to my folks' place a few towns over." I hesitated, then nodded and unlocked the door. He climbed in, throwing a small duffel bag on the floor. "Thanks, man," he said, rubbing his hands together. "It's cold as hell out there." "No problem," I replied, pulling back onto the road. "Where you headed?" He shifted in his seat, glancing out the window. "Family reunion. My folks live up near Norwood. Been trying to get there all day." Norwood wasn't far off my route, so it seemed plausible. But something about him felt off. He fidgeted a lot, hands tapping his knees, his gaze darting around like he was expecting someone to jump out of the dark. He kept talking, but his answers were vague, and every time I tried to get details about where he'd come from, he deflected. We drove in silence for a while, and the longer we went, the more I felt that gnawing discomfort in my gut. There was something unsettling about the way he watched the road, his body stiff, like he was bracing for something. I turned up the radio, hoping to drown out my unease. That's when the news alert came on. Breaking news: authorities have issued a statewide manhunt for a dangerous convict who escaped from maximum security earlier today. The man is considered armed and extremely dangerous. My grip tightened on the wheel. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't look over at him, but I could feel his eyes on me. The news anchor continued, describing the escapee's appearance. I tried to stay calm, but every detail matched the guy sitting next to me. His height, his build, even the clothes he was wearing. My heart started to race. He must have noticed the change in me because he cleared his throat. "Everything all right?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." I didn't know what to do. Pulling over wasn't an option. We were in the middle of nowhere, and if he was who I thought he was, I didn't want to provoke him. My mind raced, trying to figure out a plan. Could I drive faster? Maybe lose him at the next truck stop? But what if he got suspicious? The next few miles felt like an eternity. Every minute, I expected him to reach into his duffel and pull out a weapon. My palms were slick with sweat, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, without warning, he leaned forward, looking out the windshield. "Mind if we stop soon? I could use a break." My chest tightened. This was it. He was going to make a move. I had to stay calm. "There's a truck stop coming up," I said, my voice steady. "We can stop there." I knew that truck stop well. It had cameras, bright lights, and enough people around that I could slip away or get help without him noticing. The sign for the truck stop came into view, and I eased the truck off the highway, pulling into the well-lit lot. As we came to a stop, he shifted in his seat, glancing around as if assessing the situation. I could see his hand inching toward his duffel bag. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his tone flat. "I'll just..." Before he could finish, I flung open my door, stepping out quickly, pretending like I needed to check something on the truck. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked toward the back of the cab, hoping the distance would buy me time. I saw him glance at me through the window, then reach down for his bag. That's when I spotted a couple of truckers walking toward the diner. I hurried over to them, my voice low and urgent. "Hey, can you help me out?" I think the guy in my truck is the escaped convict from the news. Their faces paled, but they nodded, and one of them pulled out his phone to call the cops. I watched as the man inside my truck got out, his eyes scanning the lot. He saw me talking to the truckers, realized what was happening, and bolted toward the road. By the time the police arrived, he was long gone. They took my statement, assured me they'd track him down, but as I got back in my truck, all I could think about was how close I'd come. That man, whoever he was still out there, and the next person who picked him up might not be so lucky. The price of justice. I never thought it would come back to haunt me. After all, it was just a job, prosecuting criminals, putting them behind bars where they belonged. I had successfully put countless offenders away, but one case still kept me up at night. Jacob Riley, a notorious criminal, convicted for a series of violent robberies and assaults. His trial had been long and grueling, and I had fought tooth and nail to make sure he was locked away for good. It wasn't just his crimes that terrified me. It was his cold, calculating demeanor. He looked at me like I was just another obstacle in his way, a temporary problem to be removed. When the news broke that Riley had escaped from prison, I thought little of it at first. Escaped convicts were hardly rare, and the authorities were sure to catch him soon enough. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Riley had been locked in a maximum security facility, and yet he managed to break free. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was coming for me. It started with small things, unexplained knocks on my door at odd hours, a shadowy figure standing just out of view when I went to get the mail, a fleeting silhouette in my rearview mirror when I left work late at night. At first, I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the unease grew. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone was watching me. One night, as I sat in my office late, working on a new case, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, the lights flickered, and the building seemed unnaturally silent. I chalked it up to the late hour, but I knew something was wrong. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. I stood up slowly and approached the glass. Through the darkness, I could barely make out a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably familiar. Jacob Riley. My heart stopped. I rushed to the door, locking it quickly, but the sound of scraping metal sent a chill down my spine. Riley was trying to force his way in. Panic set in as I grabbed my phone, dialing 911, but before I could hit send, the lights went out completely. Total darkness. I couldn't hear a thing, just my own ragged breath and the pounding of my heart. A whisper broke through the silence. "You thought you could hide, didn't you?" I froze. The voice, low and menacing, sent a shiver down my spine. I turned slowly, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. And then I saw him, Riley, standing in the doorway, his eyes gleaming in the faint light from the street lamp outside. He grinned, his teeth white against the shadows. "I never forget a face, especially one that sent me away for life," he said, his voice dripping with venom. I took a step back, my mind racing for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The windows were too high to climb out of, and the hallway was too far to reach. My only hope was to keep him talking, delay him until help arrived. "I didn't send you away. You did that to yourself," I managed to say, trying to sound braver than I felt. Riley's smile widened. "You think it's over, don't you? You think you've won. But I'm not done. Not by a long shot." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. I could see the crazed determination in them. The same look he had in the courtroom all those years ago. The look of a man who wasn't afraid to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. And now, what he wanted was me. Then, in a flash, something crashed through the window beside me. A rock, thrown with brutal force. I screamed, stumbling back, but Riley didn't flinch. He knew it wasn't over yet. I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance, but I knew I wouldn't make it. Riley would do whatever it took to silence me before I could tell anyone what he was capable of. Just as he lunged forward, I heard the front door burst open. I turned to see the flashing lights of the police cars and the sound of officers rushing inside. But it was too late. Riley was gone. They found the broken window and the mess left behind, but Jacob Riley had vanished into the night. The only thing left was the note he'd left on my desk. "You can't run from your past." The authorities later assured me that they'd find him, but I knew better. I couldn't escape the feeling that Riley was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to finish what he'd started. And no matter how far I ran, I knew that I'd always be looking over my shoulder. Justice had its price, and it wasn't one I could ever truly pay.